Let's implement FortiGate High Availability Active Passive Configuration. In this video, FortiGate High Availability Active Passive Configuration. So we briefly discuss the HA active passive concepts. We then go through the preparation steps before we will configure the high availability setting on our FortiGate device. Then we will configure the HA active passive, and thereafter verify if our HA active passive configuration will work in our failover scenarios. In network design, we need to identify single point of failure areas in our network, and if budget permitting, we try to implement a solution to have highly available networks. Here in our sample network topology for our demonstration, we will configure an active passive high availability in our FortiGate firewalls. Of course, with our simple topology, we still have more areas for improvement other than having our firewalls in HA, like we should have multiple internet service providers as well as layer 2 switching redundancy. But our focus for this demonstration will be the configuration of HA in our FortiGate firewalls. A quick overview for our sample network. So we have a single ISP with an IP address of 100.100.1/30. The port 1 of our FortiGate firewalls FGT-A and FGT-B will have an IP of 100.100.100.2/30, so it will serve as our WAN interface. Port 2 will be our connection to our switch. So this will be our LAN interface and will have an IP of 172.16.1.1/24. Port 4 and port 5 of our FortiGate firewalls will serve as heartbeat interfaces. So the heartbeat interface will be used by the HA cluster for communication. So we will expect hello packets will be sent and received via these interfaces at regular intervals. Finally, we have our test PC with an IP address of 172.16.1.100/24. So from here, we can perform some verification if our HA cluster is working. Here are some preparation steps before we will configure our HA cluster. For updated steps, I highly recommend to visit the official Fortinet website. First, we need to make sure our firewall are configured with static IP addresses. If DHCP or PPPoE are really what is supposed to be configured, so you need to temporarily switch first to using static. You can configure back the interfaces affected to DHCP or PPPoE after the cluster is formed. You also need to make sure the FortiOS firmware version are identical on both of your firewalls. So basically, you need to check the version and similar build numbers. Same level of licensing is recommended. So for example, if you have FortiGuard web filtering, then both of your firewalls should have this license. So you have to procure for both. Otherwise, for example, if you don't have the necessary license and the other firewall has, then your cluster won't support that feature and it will follow the lower level license. Then finally, you have to check your network connections or how you connect your firewalls to other devices. For example, does your ISP router support multiple interfaces? Sometimes they are configured with only one and you have to prepare a one switch or a separate VLAN for your physical switch for one communication. This is also true with your connection to your switch. And finally, your heartbeat interfaces. For our demonstration, we make use of GNS3. So here we have the Internet Cloud. Our ISP router is connected to our firewalls. And our firewall FGT-A and FGT-B are FortiGate VMs or virtual machines. So port number 1 will serve as our WAN interface. So it will carry an IP of 100.100.2/30. So our FortiGate firewalls or VMs are connected to our unmanaged switch on port number 2. So port number 2 of our FortiGate firewalls will be our LAN connection or LAN interface. It will carry an IP address of 172.16.1/24. Port 4 and 5 of our firewalls are interconnected. We will make use of these ports as our heartbeat interfaces. So currently they are in suspended mode in our GNS3 since we haven't built our cluster yet. We will enable the port 4 and port 5 interfaces once we individually configure the cluster parameters on our firewall FGTA and FGTB. We have a single sample endpoint test-PC with an IP address of 172.16.1.100 that is connected to our LAN switch. We will make use of this virtual PC simulator to perform some testing, especially later wherein we will perform some failover scenario. With the help of this test PC, we could ascertain our configuration of our HA active passive if it's behaving correctly. We have another virtual machine here, but this is only to manage our firewall. So we could go into the web administration page of both of our firewalls and we can input or set our HA cluster parameters. Okay, so we are inside our virtual machine and I log into our first FortiGate firewall FGT-A. So I temporarily addressed on port number 10, 10, 10, 10, 2 so that we could log in using that particular IP address. You could also see here that on our port 1, which is our WAN interface, it has an IP address configured 100.100.2, and on port number 2, which is our LAN interface, it has an IP address configured 172.16.1.1/24. Take note, the allowed access for these physical interfaces are also set. It is allowed to respond to ping and HTTPS. And for our WAN interface, you have ping, HTTPS, SSH, and HTTP. Obviously, the allowed access are not really our primary concern here as we will be configuring only the high availability parameters. But in actual, you need to have the proper access to these protocols in order to manage or to log in and configure your FortiGate firewall. Next, we go to static routes. So it is still under the network menu, static routes. So I just show you minimally what are the configurations for this firewall. So you have to add this line here. So by default, there are no static routes. So you have to click the create new and add your static routes. In this case, it is a default route going to our ISP router 100.100.1. You can also verify first if this gateway IP address is indeed reachable. You can go to the CLI console and click connect and type the execute command, execute ping, and the IP address that you want to ping. In our case, it's the gateway IP address of our ISP router, and there should be a reply. Now that we have determined that our FortiGate is able to reach our ISP router, so we can close this CLI console. So next we go to the policy and objects menu and go to the IPv4 policy. So we should create a policy for our LAN to WAN. So by default, there is no policy other than the implicit policy here. So we have the implicit deny policy in our IPv4 policy. So we should create a policy for our internet access, that is from our LAN network going to the port number 1, which is going to our WAN interface to our ISP router. So if we go inside to this policy, so it is just a basic IPv4 policy. So you have the name of this policy. Your incoming interface is from your LAN going to your WAN. So your source is all or any, but this is not recommended. But again, this is for demonstration purposes only. Destination will be all, schedule will be always, service will be all. Of course, you can cater only a few allowed services in your network. It's up to you. But again, this is demonstration purposes only. The action should be accept, and we will perform network address translation. We don't have our security profiles, and we need to enable this policy. Now that our FortiGate firewall is configured, at least on its basic level, we'll test on our PC if we will be able to reach some internet or IP address in the public. So that will be ping, for example, quadruple 8. And yes, we are able to reach the public IP address quadruple 8. Now that we know that our test PC will be able to reach the internet, so there are no issues with our basic configuration. So we can now then proceed to configure the HA. So the HA is available here at the system menu, and you click this HA. So let's click HA. Okay, so we are now under the high availability settings. So the mode is standalone currently. So we have some options here. We have active, active, and active passive. So for our demonstration, we will select active passive. Let's click active passive. So you have more options now. So you have device priority. So the device with the highest priority is more likely to become the HA master. So between the active and the passive firewall, if you have a higher priority, so this device will become the active firewall. So let's stay put with this device priority 128. The group name, so you need to have some group name. So for example, let's have Inquirinity HA. So we could change the password so that we will know what is the password. So HA, let's say pass. So HA, capital H and A, and we have the pass. So we have some options for monitor interfaces and heartbeat interfaces. So for now, we will just configure the heartbeat interfaces. So as you know, we have the port number 4 and port number 5 for our heartbeat interfaces. So we have some heartbeat interface priority. We can then configure these settings as well as the monitor interfaces in the future. So for now, we will just select or configure the following. So active passive, device priority is 128, group name is Inquirinity-HA, password is HA pass, and the heartbeat interfaces is port number 4 and port number 5. So we'll now click OK to confirm our configuration. You could see here that our FGT-A firewall is configured with HA parameters and is waiting for the other firewall to be configured and to be synchronized and see if they will form as an HA cluster. Now it's time to configure or to connect to our FGT-B firewall and configure the HA parameters. We are now logged in on our FGT-B firewall. Unlike on our FortiGate A, so we still configure our interfaces with IP address, but for our second firewall, we leave it as blank. We also configure the static routes on our first firewall, but for our second FortiGate, we will not configure it. On the policies and objects, you also have the IPv4 policy on our first firewall, but for our second firewall, we don't have any IPv4 policy. So we could straight away configure the HA settings on our second firewall. Let's proceed to configure the high availability of this FGT-B firewall and match the same settings we have on our first firewall. So for the mode is active passive. Let's leave the device priority as 128. The group name will be inquirinity-ha. The password will be HA pass. So let's confirm. We don't have any session pickup monitor interfaces, but for the heartbeat interfaces, we will select port 4 and port 5. Again, we review our settings, active passive, device priority is 128, group name is inquirinity-ha, password is HAPass, heartbeat interfaces 4 and 5, and we have some interface priority for our heartbeat, but we don't configure it yet. So click OK to accept the settings. So our second firewall is also configured, and he assumed as the role as master because he is also waiting for the other firewall to be connected and to be synchronized on whether who will be the master between the two, whether it's FGTA and FGTB. All right, let's now turn on or enable the heartbeat interfaces, port number 4 and port number 5. So again, they are purposely disabled or suspended because we need to configure first our firewalls with HA parameters or configuration before we interconnect them. Now that the two firewalls are configured and are waiting for the other one to be present, so therefore we can now safely resume these interfaces. So of course, in the reality, you need to physically connect the heartbeat interfaces on both firewalls. All right, the HA cluster was formed and the FGT-B became the master and the FGT-A became the slave. So I encourage you to go to the official Fortinet website and read through the primary unit selection criteria. So it details how the FortiGate will select which is the master for the HA active passive cluster. Let's do some testing on our PC simulator if the connection to the public address 8.8.8 is still reachable. So this time we'll do a continuous ping. So now that the HA is formed or the HA cluster is formed, we need to make sure that the connectivity is still intact. And yes, there is still a reply to our public address. And we will now then proceed to simulate a failover scenario. Let's perform a failover scenario wherein let's reboot our master firewall. So in this case, this is the FGT-B. So reboot is available here. So you have the system and reboot. Okay. So we will perform the reboot and let's monitor the ping for our simulator PC. So for example, log event message is failover. So are you sure you want to reboot the device? Click OK to perform the reboot. Okay, so the master firewall is still doing a reboot. So I'm just scrolling around and you see that there is one ICMP timeout and our ping are still working fine. And if you take a look at this FGT-B, it's restarting the system. So basically, the FGTA is now being the master firewall. So FGTA is now being the master firewall and is taking up the connection for our PC. And for our final verification, so we log into FGT-A. You notice the IP address is not .2 anymore, but .3. So the FGTA, so if we go to system HA, you'll notice that the FGT-A is the master in the HA active passive cluster. So we have some more cluster configuration like active, the override scenario, the device priority, and the monitor interfaces in our future discussion. So, but for now, this is the active and passive configuration of FortiGate high availability. So in this video, FortiGate high availability, active passive configuration. So we briefly discussed the HA active passive concepts. We then discuss or enumerate the preparation steps for HA. So you'll need to make sure you have followed the preparation steps. For example, you'll have the same license level, the same version, as well as the configuration of static IP address and the connection. Then we'll proceed to demonstrate on how to configure the high availability active passive in our FortiGate firewall. We then verify the HA is formed and we test on our PC if we will be able to continue to ping the outside public IP addresses. So I hope you find this video helpful and thank you for viewing.